Hi, this is Josh Marshall from TPM Media. It is Wednesday, June 6, 2007. Yesterday, Bradley Schlozman went before the Senate Judiciary Committee to testify about the voter purge story and related matters. Now, Schlozman figures into the U.S. Attorney Purge story in a number of ways, but his central role is his role in pushing voter suppression efforts around the country, using the power of the Department of Justice and later his power as U.S. Attorney in Kansas City. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about voter suppression efforts? These are various tricks and tactics you use to suppress minority voter turnout in key swing states around the country to help Republican candidates, since the thinking is that minority voters tend to vote disproportionately for Democrats. Now, what the senators keyed in on in Schlotzman's testimony was something he did just before the November 2006 election. He brought a series of vote fraud indictments just before the election. Now, the reason this caused so much concern is this goes against explicit Department of Justice guidelines. You're not supposed to bring politically tinged vote fraud indictments just before an election because it can have the direct effect of suppressing voter turnout. So they wanted to ask Schlotzman, why did you violate Department of Justice guidelines to bring these vote fraud indictments just in time for the election in an apparent effort to suppress voter turnout? Take a look.
You're aware of the Justice Department's guidebook on federal prosecution of election offenses, the so-called Red Book, aren't you?
I am somewhat familiar with it. In fact, the department today announced that they're issuing a new book that will be
did they have this, never mind what they're doing today, did they have this book at the time you were the interim U.S. Attorney?
Yes, they did, Senator.
And you're somewhat familiar with it?
Well, I was in the Civil Rights Division. We focused
on... When
you
were U.S. Attorney?
Oh.
Were you somewhat familiar with it, or were you familiar? Because my understanding is that all U.S. attorneys are supposed to be familiar with it.
Yes, I was.
Were you or weren't you?
I was familiar with it, Senator, yes.
That's a little bit better, thank you. You didn't think that when the U.S. Justice Department stepped in, that would have any effect whatsoever that close to an election?
Well, there was no individual who was possibly going to be disenfranchised or who was
That's not my question at all, Mr. Schlozman, and you know it. Did you really think that having the Department of Justice bring a charge like that close to the election would have no effect on the election? I'm not talking about an individual being stopped from voting, but have no effect on the election?
I did not think it was going to have any effect on the election in this case, no, Senator.
You're amazing. Do you read the papers at all?
I do.
Do you watch the news at all?
Occasionally, yes.
Do you ever watch them before an election?
Senator, I mean, I watch the news on occasion.
Would it have affected the ability to bring the prosecution if you just waited a few weeks till the election was over?
The Department of Justice does not time prosecutions to elections.
Well, yes, they do. That's what the manual says. And you, rather reluctantly, I felt, admitted you actually did read it when you became the interim U.S. Attorney. The fact is, would it have changed the outcome of your prosecution had you waited a few weeks to bring it?
I don't know. I doubt there would have been any impact on the actual prosecution. Again, I acted at the direction of the Public Integrity Section.
Too.
I just want to read you an excerpt from a Missouri Republican Party press release from November 2nd, 2006. Quote, "It is very disturbing that members of this left-leaning group have been indicted for engaging in serious voter fraud designed to cause chaos and controversy at the polls in order to help Democrats to try to steal next week's election," said Paul Sloka, Communications Director for the Missouri Republican Party. "This illegal assault on our election system should concern every voter in this state who deserves to know that their legitimate ballots won't be canceled out by fraudulent ones. It also raises serious questions about the Democratic Party and Claire McCaskill's involvement with ACORN." End of quote. Would you say this statement was intended to affect voters' decisions?
Senator, I can't speak for anybody else. I mean, I don't know why he made that.
You know how to read a statement, and you hear something like that, doesn't that sound to you like something that's trying to persuade people to make a decision about an election?
Senator, I mean, I'll probably improper for me to characterize his testimony. I mean, I don't know why he said what he said.
Well, I think you do. I think clearly it was intended to affect the outcome of the election. The timing is obvious.
I'm not a U.S. attorney, But those of us who are around elections and the system of justice know that those are the rules. And no one before I heard has come up with the tortured explanation that you did to Senator Leahy, that this isn't going to deter a voter from voting. That's not the point of this. The point of it is it might influence an election. Isn't that right?
Senator, I did not think it was going to influence the election at all. And I contacted
But that's not your judgment. You used your own judgment, being 35 years of age, not having a wide range of experience here, and you overruled something that is very explicit in the book, in the manual, right?
Isn't
that what you did?
I got my direction from the Public Integrity section
Yeah.
at the Department of Justice.
I know, but you have to make some of your own decisions here too. Did you know of this sentence in the book?
I mean, I believe I was probably aware of it, yes.
Yeah, and did you believe I was?
Well, I mean, Senator, I suppose I was responsible for being aware of the Election Crimes Manual. Again, I checked with the Public Integrity section, which I was required to do under the U.S. Attorney's Manual, and sought direction on whether I was to wait. And we had a grand jury that was going to be...
And Mr., what was his name, DeSantos?
Monsanto, yes.
Yeah. He will state, if we ask him explicitly, with no reservation, he ordered you to do it or told you it was okay to go ahead and do it.
That is correct.
As you can see, it wasn't a fun day up at the Senate yesterday for Brad Schlozman. And what Senator Schumer was pressing him on yesterday was what Schlozman was told by this guy, Craig Dunsanto. He's the director of the Election Crimes Branch at the Department of Justice. And the reason that Schumer was so suspicious that this guy had actually signed off on what Schlozman did is that Dunsanto is actually the one who wrote that manual, that red book they keep holding up in Schlotzman's face. Now, after the testimony, we found an email from one of those Department of Justice document dumps from David Iglesias, of all people, the fired U.S. attorney from New Mexico, who'd worked with Dunsanto back in 2004, and he gives a very different rendition of Dunsanto's position on whether you bring these election-timed indictments. If you look just beneath the viewer, we have a link to an article at TPM Muckraker that explains the contradiction. We'll keep looking at it, and we'll bring you more as we find more. This is Josh Marshall from TPM Media, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.